My father slapped me across the face on his 60th birthday. This was the same man who abandoned me at an airport terminal when I was 9 years old, just so he could enjoy a luxury vacation with his new wife and her children. Back then, I called my estranged mother, and she landed in a private jet to save me. When my father returned from his trip, he found my room completely empty and a legal notice sitting on my bed, causing his wife to scream in pure panic. Today, 24 years later, that slap in front of hundreds of people was the exact trigger I needed to end his empire for good. I am Riley, 33 years old, and the founder of a forensic financial intelligence firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The heavy leather-bound folder slammed onto my china plate. It shattered my slice of chocolate cake and sent shards of icing flying across the pristine white tablecloth. We were in the center of the VIP dining room at the most exclusive country club in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers buzzed softly overhead, casting a warm glow on the hundreds of wealthy guests who had gathered to celebrate my father Thomas and his milestone birthday. But right now, my father was not acting like a celebrated real estate tycoon. He was acting like a desperate man cornered by his own greed. "Sign the papers, Riley," he ordered. His voice was a harsh whisper designed to evade the ears of the country club elite sitting at the surrounding tables. I looked down at the document. It was an irrevocable transfer of assets. He wanted me to sign over the small trust fund my grandmother had left me. I picked up my linen napkin and calmly wiped a smudge of chocolate from my thumb, taking my time to answer. "I am not signing anything, Thomas," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. My half-sister Madison slammed her champagne flute onto the table, spilling the expensive liquid over the floral centerpiece. "You are being completely selfish, Riley," she hissed. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she glared at me with pure hatred. "Kendrick needs that capital injection for his hedge fund by tomorrow morning. Family helps family." I shifted my gaze to Kendrick. Madison's husband was a 33-year-old African-American investment manager who usually wore custom-tailored suits and projected an image of absolute financial dominance. He was the golden son-in-law, the man who was supposed to double the family wealth. But tonight, Kendrick was sweating profusely. His usually confident posture had crumbled into nervous fidgeting. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at his expensive leather shoes. He looked exactly like a man who knew his fraudulent house of cards was about to collapse. "Family helps family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air for a long moment. "That is an interesting concept coming from you, Madison. But the answer is no. I am not draining my grandmother's legacy to bail out a failing portfolio that I have absolutely nothing to do with." Thomas leaned in close, pressing his hands flat against the table. The smell of aged scotch and raw panic radiated from him. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," he growled deeply. "You are just a glorified accountant. You do not understand how real money works in this town. Kendrick is managing high-level investments and he has a temporary liquidity issue. We need your trust fund to bridge the gap until his next quarter returns come in. It is a simple bridge loan. If you do not pick up that pen and sign this document right now, you will be cut out of this family forever. You will get nothing from my estate." I picked up the thick folder and handed it back to him. "Then consider me cut out," I said. "I will not fund a sinking ship just to save your massive ego." The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot through the massive dining room. Thomas had struck me with the back of his hand using so much force that my head snapped sharply to the side. The heavy gold signet ring on his right hand caught my lips, splitting the skin instantly. A collective gasp rippled through the venue. Every single conversation in the VIP room stopped. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The jazz band playing softly in the corner abruptly halted their music, leaving a heavy dead silence in their wake. Hundreds of eyes turned toward our table, watching the great real estate mogul Thomas strike his own daughter in the middle of his birthday gala. The silence was absolutely suffocating. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the wealthy socialites at the next table. I could hear the ice clinking softly as it melted in the water glasses nearby. Everyone was frozen, waiting to see if I would break down in tears or run out of the room in shame. I did not cry. I did not even raise my hand to cradle my stinging cheek. I slowly turned my face back to look directly into my father's eyes. I lifted a single finger to my lower lip, felt the warm copper taste of blood, and simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made my father take a sudden nervous step back. His chest heaved as he realized he had just lost complete control in front of the most important investors and politicians in Atlanta. Before Thomas could try to salvage his public image, his wife stepped forward. Brenda. My stepmother was a woman who practically bathed in new money and old resentments. She wore a gaudy emerald necklace that clashed violently with her bitter, twisted expression. She looked down her nose at me, her lips curling into a vicious, disgusted sneer. "You always love to ruin everything," she spat, her voice carrying loudly across the silent room, ensuring every guest heard her vitriol. "You are just a bitter, jealous outsider who resents our happiness. We should have left you at gate 42 and never looked back." Brenda's words hung in the chandelier-lit air of the VIP dining room. Gate 42, the exact gate at Atlanta International Airport where 24 years ago they had walked away with their designer luggage and left a 9-year-old girl sitting alone with a crushed boarding pass and a $50 bill. I did not break eye contact with Brenda. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth, right next to the shattered pieces of my plate. "You did leave me, Brenda?" I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm that sliced through the whispers of the surrounding tables. "You left a 9-year-old child sitting at gate 42 with $50 and a pat on the head so you could fly first class to Bali. But please tell me, did you actually enjoy the complimentary champagne on that flight?" Brenda opened her mouth to snap back, but I did not give her a fraction of a second to breathe. "Because from what I recall, the vacation ended the second you landed back on American soil." I continued, standing up slowly to match her posture. "I remember the exact look on your face when my mother's legal team met you directly on the tarmac. How did it feel, Brenda? How did it feel to come back tanned and relaxed, only to find a federal custody lawsuit waiting for you that immediately froze every single one of Thomas's bank accounts?" Brenda's spray-tanned face turned a blotchy, furious shade of red. She glanced around nervously. The mayor of Atlanta was sitting 2 tables away, his fork completely frozen halfway to his mouth. The CEO of the largest regional bank was leaning in, blatantly eavesdropping. The facade of their perfect high society family was cracking wide open for the entire room to witness. Thomas slammed both his hands flat on the table, causing the expensive crystal and silverware to rattle violently. "Shut your mouth, Riley," he ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You are making a scene in front of my guests. You will respect your stepmother." "Respect," I echoed, letting out a short, sharp laugh. "You want respect after demanding I hand over my grandmother's trust fund to cover Kendrick's catastrophic market losses. You slap me across the face in front of your high society friends and then demand respect." I took a step around the table, closing the distance between my father and me. Thomas was a large man, used to using his physical size to intimidate boardrooms and construction contractors. He puffed out his chest, towering over me, trying to force me to back down. I held my ground, perfectly still. "You drained your early accounts, fighting my mother, just to keep yourself out of a federal prison for child abandonment," I said, stepping directly into his personal space. "You settled that lawsuit by promising you would never touch the trust fund grandmother set up for me. And now here you are, 60 years old, and begging for the exact same money you legally swore you would never touch. Why is that, Thomas? Why are you suddenly so desperate for a small trust fund when you supposedly own half the commercial real estate in this city?" "Keep your voice down," Thomas hissed, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, bruising. I looked down at his hand and then back up at his face. "Remove your hand from my arm, or I will break your fingers," I said quietly. Madison slammed her hands against the back of her chair. "You are a psycho, Riley," she yelled. "Dad is just trying to give you an opportunity to invest in Kendrick's fund. We are offering you a chance to be part of the family wealth, and you are acting like a complete lunatic." I yanked my arm out of my father's grip. "An opportunity," I repeated. I turned to look at Madison, who was practically vibrating with rage in her designer silk dress. Kendrick is drowning, Madison. He is bleeding capital, and your father knows it. That is why he invited me tonight. This is not a birthday dinner. This is a shakedown. Thomas stepped horizontally, blocking my view of the room, trying to physically shield this conversation from the guests. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged with panic. You are going to walk out of this room right now, he threatened, his voice shaking with absolute rage. You are going to walk out that door, and you are never going to show your face in my presence again. You are nothing to me. You have always been nothing to me. A bitter little girl who could not handle the fact that I built a real family without her. I smiled again, feeling the sharp sting of my split lip. A real family, I said, letting my gaze drift over Brenda, who was clutching her emerald necklace, and Madison, who was frantically texting on her phone. A real family built on stolen funds and offshore shell companies. I wonder how your real family will hold up when the liquidity dries up completely by tomorrow afternoon. Thomas's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. The panic was entirely visible now, stripping away his billionaire facade. He realized I knew too much. He realized the people at the surrounding tables, the people who funded his massive development projects, were listening to every single word. The illusion of his invincible wealth was crumbling right here in the middle of his 60th birthday party. He straightened his jacket, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He looked past me toward the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the VIP dining room. He raised his hand high in the air and snapped his fingers with a sharp, echoing crack. "Security!" he shouted, his voice booming across the entire dining hall. "Throw this ungrateful trash out of my club immediately." The heavy brass-handled doors of the VIP dining room swung open instantly. 3 men in immaculate black suits marched through the sea of horrified guests. Leading them was Marcus, the towering head of security for the country club, a former military man who usually handled the discreet removals of over-intoxicated billionaires. He moved with absolute precision, and the crowd of wealthy socialites parted for him instantly. Thomas adjusted his custom silk cuffs and squared his shoulders, instantly regaining his arrogant swagger. The momentary panic I had caused him was replaced by the comforting, familiar shield of his wealth and social influence. He pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at my face. "Take this woman by the arms and remove her from my sight," Thomas commanded loudly, his voice booming with authority. "She is trespassing on a private event." Madison could not resist the opportunity to kick me while I was surrounded. She stepped out from behind Kendrick, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She crossed her arms and surveyed me with a look of absolute pity mixed with venom. "You are a complete embarrassment, Riley," Madison sneered, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Look at you, wearing an off-the-rack suit, trying to play the tough corporate boss. Go back to your sad little accounting cubicle, get back in your beat-up sedan, and drive back to whatever miserable apartment you live in. You do not belong here. You have never belonged here. Kendrick and I are dealing with multi-million-dollar acquisitions, and you are here begging for attention on our father's birthday." I let her talk. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. "Are those the same acquisitions Kendrick is frantically trying to hide in the Cayman Islands?" I asked casually. Madison's face contorted. "You are obsessed with my husband because you cannot get a man of your own." She turned to the guards, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Security, please grab her. She is a psychotic stalker." Brenda eagerly joined the dog pile, stepping up beside her daughter to deliver her own threats. "Make sure her name is permanently blacklisted from the system," Marcus, Brenda instructed, waving her diamond-clad hand in the air. "I want her picture posted at the front gate. If she sets 1 foot on the golf course or near the valet driveway, I want the local police involved immediately. We pay $300,000 a year for platinum membership, and I refuse to share oxygen with this unstable creature. I will personally call your firm tomorrow morning, Riley, and ensure you are fired for assaulting a prominent citizen." Thomas puffed out his chest, looking at the 2 guards. "You heard my wife, Marcus. Grab her by the arms. Use physical force if you have to. Take her out through the kitchen service exit. I do not want her dirtying the main lobby on her way out to the gutter." The two burly security guards stepped forward, moving to flank me on either side. Their heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor. The entire room collectively held its breath. The mayor stopped whispering to his wife. The bank executives leaned forward in their leather chairs, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Everyone waited for the inevitable moment. They wanted to see the poor, bitter, estranged daughter physically hauled out, kicking and screaming into the humid Atlanta night. I did not move a single muscle. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I calmly reached over to the table and picked up a crystal flute of champagne that had miraculously survived Thomas slamming his hands down moments earlier. I held the glass by the elegant stem, raised it slightly toward my father in a mock toast, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cool liquid stung my split lip, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I looked right past Thomas and locked eyes with Marcus. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He was less than 2 feet away from me. He looked at Thomas, then looked back at me. A silent communication passed between us. The silence was so profound you could hear the ice shifting in the cocktail glasses of the onlookers. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were watching a high-stakes chess match, and they suddenly realized they did not know who was actually controlling the board. The heavy tension in the room thickened until it was practically suffocating. "Well," Thomas barked impatiently, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as the veins in his neck bulged. "What are you waiting for? I pay your salary, Marcus. I said throw her out right now." Marcus completely ignored Thomas. It was a subtle shift in body language, but in a room full of people obsessed with power and hierarchy, it was as loud as an explosion. Marcus stepped smoothly around my father, completely disregarding his outstretched pointing finger. He walked directly up to me and stopped. Thomas dropped his hand, his mouth falling open in sheer confusion. Brenda blinked rapidly, her sneer faltering into a look of genuine bewilderment. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden, inexplicable sliver of doubt. Marcus did not even glance in Thomas's direction. Instead, the massive head of security lowered his gaze and offered me a deep, respectful bow. The kind of bow reserved for absolute, unquestionable authority. He straightened up, his face perfectly neutral, and his voice echoed clearly across the absolute dead silence of the VIP dining room. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his tone ringing with unwavering professional deference. "Would you like me to escort these trespassers off your property?" The absolute silence in the VIP dining room stretched into a thick, suffocating blanket. Thomas stared at the head of security, with his mouth slightly open, unable to process the words he had just heard. The cognitive dissonance was physically paralyzing him. He was Thomas, the untouchable real estate titan of Atlanta. He did not get thrown out of places. He did the throwing out. A harsh, nervous bark of laughter erupted from his chest. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus Thomas demanded, pointing a thick, trembling finger at the guard's chest. "I pay your salary. I am a platinum founding member of this establishment. You work for me. Grab that crazy woman and drag her out of here before I call the board of directors and have your pension revoked." Marcus stood completely rigid. He did not flinch. He did not even look at my father. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on me, waiting for my command. "Your membership was revoked at 5 o'clock this evening," Sir Marcus said, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. "Your access card has been deactivated, and your line of credit at the bar has been permanently closed." Brenda clutched Thomas by the arm, her heavy emerald necklace rattling against her collarbone. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy socialites who were now openly staring at our table. "Thomas, do something!" Brenda hissed, her voice shrill with embarrassment. "Call Richard. Call the club president right now. Have this incompetent guard fired. This is a complete humiliation." I reached down and calmly set my crystal champagne flute on the table. The glass made a sharp ringing sound against the hardwood. "You cannot call Richard, Brenda," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously smooth. "Richard resigned 3 weeks ago. He is currently sitting on a beach in Monaco, trying to pretend his legacy is not in ruins." Thomas whipped his head toward me. His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of red. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled, taking a threatening step forward. I stepped to the side, allowing the two massive security guards to part from me. I projected my voice so the mayor of Atlanta sitting 2 tables away could hear every single syllable. I wanted the regional bank executives and the city planners in the room to understand exactly what was happening. This country club has been bleeding capital for 2 straight years, Thomas first announced clearly. Their operational costs exceeded their revenue, and their commercial mortgage defaulted. The board of directors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy restructuring 90 days ago behind closed doors. They were desperate for a quiet buyout to avoid a massive public scandal. Thomas let out another harsh, dismissive laugh. That is mathematically impossible. I review the regional commercial real estate filings every single morning. There was no buyout on public record. There was no transfer of deed. That is because the mezzanine debt was acquired by a blind trust, I replied, stepping closer to him. An anonymous private equity vehicle called Obsidian Holding Group. Obsidian purchased the entirety of the club's distressed debt, assumed all operational liabilities, and effectively dissolved the board of directors in a leveraged buyout. Thomas sneered, his lip curling in utter disgust. He looked me up and down, taking in my understated business suit. And let me guess. You are the junior accountant for Obsidian. You think managing their spreadsheets gives you some kind of ultimate authority here. You are just a glorified pencil pusher, Riley. You have no real power. I am not their accountant, Thomas, I said, letting a razor-sharp edge slip into my voice. I am the sole proprietor. I am Obsidian Holding Group. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was immediate and loud. The CEO of the regional bank leaned over to his wife and began whispering frantically. A prominent judge sitting near the window actually dropped his fork onto his plate. Brenda looked around the room, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She is lying, Thomas, Brenda shrieked, pointing at me with a manicured hand. Look at her. She buys her clothes off the rack. She does not have the capital to buy a parking lot, let alone a country club. Call the police. Have her arrested for corporate fraud. I looked at Brenda with absolute pity. You can check the county clerk records tomorrow morning, Brenda. Or you can ask the mayor sitting right over there. He approved the commercial zoning transfer for me last Thursday. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, suddenly finding his napkin incredibly interesting. He did not meet Thomas's eyes. Thomas took a physical step backward, his broad chest heaving. His wealthy, invincible facade was visibly cracking. The man who had confidently slapped me across the face minutes ago was now sweating profusely under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. The illusion of his limitless power was breaking apart right in front of his most important investors. "Where did you get that kind of money?" Thomas stammered, his voice dropping its authoritative boom and cracking with raw panic. "You have nothing. You left my house 24 years ago with a garbage bag full of clothes and $50. I left your house with my dignity," I corrected him. "And I spent the last 14 years building a forensic financial intelligence firm that tracks the dirty money of men exactly like you. You thought I was sitting in a cubicle doing tax returns. In reality, I have been auditing offshore corporate accounts for federal agencies. I took one final step, bringing me face to face with the man who had abandoned me at Gate 42. You demanded my grandmother's trust fund to save your empire tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "But the absolute truth is, Thomas, you are standing inside my empire right now, and I want you out of it." Madison had been standing behind Kendrick, her face cycling rapidly through shock, denial, and finally sheer terror. She looked at the society wives who were now openly whispering and pointing at her. She looked at the bank executives who were pulling out their smartphones to text their brokers. Her entire social standing, her entire identity was evaporating in real time. She shoved past Kendrick, practically tearing the silk of her designer dress. "No," Madison screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "No, this is not happening. You are a liar." She sprinted across the dining room floor, her expensive heels skidding wildly on the polished hardwood. She shoved past a waiter carrying a tray of appetizers, sending smoked salmon and caviar crashing to the ground. She lunged onto the small elevated stage where the jazz band was standing, completely frozen in shock. Madison grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand, yanking the microphone aggressively from its clip. A loud, piercing burst of audio feedback screeched through the room, making several guests cover their ears in pain. She stood on the stage, breathing heavily, pointing the microphone directly at me. Her perfect blowout was ruined. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. "Do not listen to her," Madison screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing through the massive dining hall and out into the main lobby. "She is lying. She does not own anything. She is a thief who embezzled millions of dollars from my husband." The sharp screech of audio feedback from the microphone ripped through the VIP dining room. Madison stood on the elevated stage, clutching the heavy metal stand with white knuckles. Her chest heaved rapidly as she stared down at me. The absolute panic in her eyes was masked by a thick layer of pure, unadulterated venom. "She is a fraud," Madison shrieked into the microphone. Her voice was painfully amplified, bouncing off the high acoustic ceilings and vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She does not own this club. She is a jealous, bitter spinster who has spent her entire miserable life obsessing over us." I stood my ground, watching my half-sister unravel in real time. The elite guests who had previously been frozen in complete shock were now mobilizing. All around the lavish room, the wealthy citizens of Atlanta were pulling out their smartphones. The subtle glow of recording screens illuminated the dim, ambient light of the dining hall. The mayor's wife was openly filming with a gleeful expression. The bank executives were leaning forward, capturing every single second of the public meltdown. Thomas frantically waved his arms, trying to command them to stop, but he was completely powerless against a room full of people who thrived on high society scandals. "She is nothing," Madison continued, her voice growing increasingly hysterical as she paced the small wooden stage. "She is a low-level accountant who got fired and decided to target my husband. She embezzled money from Kendrick. She stole from his hedge fund to fund this pathetic little fantasy. Look at her. Look at this sad 33-year-old woman who has absolutely no one. No husband and no family. She lies awake in her cheap apartment trying to destroy my perfect marriage because no man will ever look at her twice." The room was completely captivated by the chaotic performance. Madison was desperately painting a picture of me as a deranged stalker, hoping to protect the carefully curated image she had spent years building. She played the part of the wealthy, successful wife, aggressively defending her brilliant husband. But her performance was visibly cracking. Her hands were shaking violently, and her heavy stage makeup could not hide the frantic sweat beading along her forehead. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not raise my voice to interrupt her frantic tirade. I simply offered her a slow, chilling smile. It was a look of absolute calculated pity. That simple smile pushed Madison over the edge. Her fragile illusion of control shattered completely. She dropped the heavy microphone, letting it crash onto the wooden stage floor with a deafening thud that made the front row of guests wince. She spun around and snatched a half-full champagne flute from a tray left abandoned on a nearby cocktail table. With a guttural scream of pure rage, she hurled the heavy crystal glass directly at my head. I did not flinch. I barely even shifted my weight. The crystal flute sailed past my left shoulder and smashed violently against the solid mahogany pillar behind me. Shards of expensive glass and sticky champagne rained down onto the polished hardwood floor. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Several women screamed and stepped back quickly, shielding their designer silk dresses from the flying debris. Marcus, the head of security, immediately stepped forward, his large hand reaching for his radio, but I held up a single finger. I signaled for him to stand down. He stopped instantly, resuming his respectful stance behind me, waiting for my command. I brushed a tiny fragment of glass off the lapel of my tailored jacket. Then I began to walk toward the stage. My footsteps were slow and deliberate. The crowd parted for me exactly the way they had parted for security moments earlier. Madison watched me approach her chest, heaving heavily under her silk dress. The arrogant bravado had instantly drained from her body, leaving only a terrified woman who realized she had just assaulted someone in front of 100 recording smartphones. She stumbled backward away from the microphone until her spine hit the back wall of the stage. I stepped gracefully onto the elevated platform. I did not bother picking up the microphone from the floor. The room was so incredibly silent that my voice would carry without any artificial amplification. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from my half-sister, invading her personal space and forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. A perfect marriage. I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity that easily reached the surrounding tables. That is a fascinating narrative, Madison. But we both know you are currently sleeping in the guest room of your heavily mortgaged mansion. We both know Kendrick spends 3 nights a week sleeping on the leather sofa in his downtown office just to avoid your endless screaming matches. Madison opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly white under the stage lights. "You stand up here and call me a thief," I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, dangerous whisper. "But you maxed out 5 different platinum credit cards last month alone, just to maintain the grand illusion of your high society lifestyle. Your husband's hedge fund is leveraged to the absolute hilt. He is bleeding capital faster than he can forge his quarterly reports. And that bespoke luxury life you project to all these people filming you right now, it is a complete fabrication." I reached out with terrifying slowness and lightly tapped the massive diamond pendant resting on her chest. Madison flinched instantly, as if I had burned her skin with a hot iron. "You are wearing high-grade cubic zirconia tonight, Madison," I stated clearly, ensuring the nearby guests heard every single syllable. "You pawned the real diamonds 3 weeks ago to make payroll for Kendrick's skeletal staff. You are standing on a stage screaming about my pathetic life, while you are quite literally wearing fake jewelry to cover up a multi-million-dollar financial fraud." The silence in the VIP room shattered into a chaotic chorus of gasps and frantic whispering. The smartphones angled closer, zooming in on Madison's pale face. She looked down at her pendant, her hands flying up to cover her chest in a desperate, futile attempt to hide the truth. She was completely broken, stripped of every single lie she had used to elevate herself above me for her entire life. Before Madison could collapse completely onto the wooden floor, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. Kendrick stepped onto the stage, positioning himself firmly between his trembling wife and me. He smoothed the lapels of his $5,000 bespoke suit, adjusting his silk tie with a forced, rigid calm. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles twitched visibly under his dark skin. The charismatic golden son-in-law was gone, replaced by a man staring directly into the abyss of his own total ruin. He leaned down, his dark eyes burning with desperate ferocity as he glared at me. "You are playing with federal law, Riley," he threatened, his voice a low, vibrating hiss meant only for me. "I will personally hand you over to the SEC." I stood perfectly still on the wooden stage, letting his empty threat hang in the humid air of the VIP dining room. Kendrick glared down at me, his chest puffed out in a desperate display of manufactured dominance. He adjusted his $5,000 bespoke silk tie with a sharp, jerky movement, attempting to project the image of an untouchable Wall Street titan. "You think you can waltz into this club and throw around baseless accusations?" He sneered loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the wealthy guests recording us on their phones. "Accessing confidential financial records without proper authorization is a Class C felony, Riley. You are looking at wire fraud, corporate espionage, and severe violations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I will have my legal team draft a federal injunction so fast it will make your head spin. You have crossed the line into federal jurisdiction, and you are entirely out of your depth." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the beads of sweat forming along his perfectly groomed hairline. "The Sarbanes-Oxley Act." I repeated, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision. "That is an incredibly bold citation for a man who has not filed an honest quarterly earnings report since 2019. Do you really want to discuss Section 404, Kendrick? Because auditing your internal control structures took my forensic team exactly 3 hours. That is how spectacularly sloppy your books are." Kendrick's jaw tightened. He took half a step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You do not know what you are talking about," he spat. "You are a glorified bookkeeper. We are executing high-frequency arbitrage and dealing with complex collateralized debt obligations. These are sophisticated liquidity bridging mechanisms that you simply cannot comprehend from your little cubicle. When I temporarily reallocate capital, it is completely shielded under Regulation D exemptions. My compliance officers have approved every single transfer." From the floor of the dining room, my father Thomas let out a loud, booming laugh. His wealthy facade was quickly returning now that his golden son-in-law was stepping up to defend the family honor. "Listen to him," Riley Thomas shouted, pointing a thick finger at me. "He manages billions of dollars for the most elite families in Atlanta. You manage calculators. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the entire city." Brenda clapped her hands together, her emerald necklace sparkling under the chandeliers. "She is a criminal," Brenda declared triumphantly. "Have her locked up. I want her in handcuffs before dessert is served." Madison, who was still backed against the rear wall of the stage, suddenly stopped crying. The color returned to her face as she watched her husband verbally attack me. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from her cheek and lifted her chin. "Ruin her," Madison hissed. "Show everyone exactly what a bitter, pathetic liar she is." The surrounding crowd of socialites and bank executives leaned in closer. The mayor of Atlanta was holding his phone perfectly steady, capturing every second of the confrontation. They were all waiting to see if the brilliant investment manager could crush the estranged daughter. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Kendrick. I watched the frantic pulse beating rapidly at the base of his neck. "Your compliance officer is a 24-year-old recent college graduate whom you intimidated into signing blank ledgers," I stated, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a sentence. "And Regulation D does not cover the illegal commingling of client portfolios to cover your massive personal margin calls." Kendrick swallowed hard, but he stubbornly refused to break eye contact. "It is a temporary reallocation of liquid assets," he argued, his voice rising in volume. "Perfectly legal under the current market stress provisions." "Temporary reallocation," I said, raising a single eyebrow. "Is that what you call the 6 separate wire transfers you made last Tuesday afternoon? Let us talk about those transfers, Kendrick. Let us talk about the $14 million you moved from your clients' pension accounts directly into a phantom shell corporation located in the Bahamas." The dining room went dead silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning unit. "That shell corporation is registered to a post office box and listed under your wife's maiden name." I continued, stepping smoothly into his personal space. "You did not invest that money, Kendrick. You stole it to pay off the catastrophic leverage debt you accumulated betting against the tech sector last quarter. You are running a glorified Ponzi scheme, and the bottom has officially dropped out." Kendrick's dark skin turned an ashen gray. His bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him as his posture completely collapsed. He looked out at the audience. Several of the regional bank executives sitting at the front tables were currently invested in his hedge fund. They were staring at him with expressions of absolute, undisguised horror. "That is privileged proprietary trading data," Kendrick stammered, raising a shaking hand. "You hacked my private servers. You stole encrypted trade secrets. I will call the Securities and Exchange Commission right this second. I have friends at the SEC. I have golfing buddies in the Federal Enforcement Division. They will raid your pathetic little accounting firm by midnight, and you will spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary." He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He held it up like a weapon, a desperate man clinging to the very last shred of his fabricated power. I looked at his trembling hand. I looked at Thomas, who was suddenly clutching the edge of his dining table, his face a mask of dawning terror. I looked at Madison, who had pressed both her hands over her mouth. I let the absolute silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. Then I laughed. It was not a forced laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a cold, chilling, genuine laugh that cut through the humid air of the VIP dining room like a scalpel. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent 24 years waiting for this exact moment. "You want to call the SEC, Kendrick?" I asked, smiling as I watched the final spark of hope die in his eyes. "Do not bother. I already sent them your hard drives." The sharp screech of the microphone feedback faded, leaving a tense, ringing silence in its wake. Madison stood on the stage with her chest heaving as she glared down at me. Before I could even respond to her hysterical accusations, a heavy hand clamped down on the microphone stand. Kendrick stepped onto the elevated stage, positioning himself firmly between his trembling wife and me. He smoothed the lapels of his $5,000 bespoke suit, adjusting his silk tie with a forced, rigid calm. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles twitched visibly under his dark skin. The charismatic golden son-in-law was gone, replaced by a man staring directly into the abyss of his own total ruin, but still desperately trying to play the part of the untouchable Wall Street titan. "You are playing with federal law." "Riley," he threatened, his voice a low, vibrating hiss, meant only for me. "I will personally hand you over to the SEC." I stood perfectly still on the wooden stage, letting his empty threat hang in the humid air of the VIP dining room. "You think you can waltz into this club and throw around baseless accusations?" Kendrick sneered loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the wealthy guests recording us on their phones. Accessing confidential financial records without proper authorization is a Class C felony, Riley. You are looking at wire fraud, corporate espionage, and severe violations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I will have my legal team draft a federal injunction so fast it will make your head spin. You have crossed the line into federal jurisdiction, and you are entirely out of your depth. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the beads of sweat forming along his perfectly groomed hairline. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I repeated, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision. That is an incredibly bold citation for a man who has not filed an honest quarterly earnings report since 2019. Do you really want to discuss Section 404, Kendrick? Because auditing your internal control structures took my forensic team exactly 3 hours. That is how spectacularly sloppy your books are. Kendrick took half a step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You do not know what you are talking about," he spat. "You are a glorified bookkeeper. We are executing high-frequency arbitrage and dealing with complex collateralized debt obligations. These are sophisticated liquidity bridging mechanisms that you simply cannot comprehend from your little cubicle. When I temporarily reallocate capital, it is completely shielded under Regulation D exemptions. My compliance officers have approved every single transfer." From the floor of the dining room, my father Thomas let out a loud, booming laugh. His wealthy facade was quickly returning now that his golden son-in-law was stepping up to defend the family honor. "Listen to him," Riley Thomas shouted, pointing a thick finger at me. "He manages billions of dollars for the most elite families in Atlanta. You manage calculators. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the entire city." Brenda clapped her hands together, her emerald necklace sparkling under the chandeliers. "She is a criminal," Kendrick Brenda declared triumphantly. "Have her locked up. I want her in handcuffs before dessert is served." Madison, who was still backed against the rear wall of the stage, suddenly stopped crying. The color returned to her face as she watched her husband verbally attack me. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from her cheek and lifted her chin. "Ruin her," Kendrick, Madison hissed. "Show everyone exactly what a bitter, pathetic liar she is." I kept my eyes locked entirely on Kendrick. I watched the frantic pulse beating rapidly at the base of his neck. I let out a slow, chilling, genuine laugh. It was not a forced chuckle or a nervous reaction. It was the sound of absolute victory. "You want to call the SEC, Kendrick?" I asked, smiling as I watched the final spark of bravado die in his eyes. "Do not bother. I already sent them your hard drives." Kendrick stood absolutely paralyzed. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray under the harsh stage lights. His hands fell limply to his sides, the perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking too large for his deflating posture. I turned away from my sweating brother-in-law and addressed the sea of shocked faces surrounding the stage. I projected my voice, ensuring every single wealthy patron in the VIP dining room heard the absolute truth. "For those of you who only know me as Thomas's estranged daughter, or Madison's favorite punchline, allow me to properly introduce myself," I announced. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial Forensics. My firm specializes in dismantling corporate fraud tracing, offshore tax evasion, and prosecuting embezzlement across international borders. We hold federal contracts with the Department of Justice, the IRS, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And for the past 6 months, my primary target has been Kendrick's hedge fund. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. "Let us review the ledger, shall we?" I said, my tone analytical and completely devoid of emotion. June 14th. Kendrick authorized a wire transfer of $2.4 million from the Horizon Tech pension portfolio. That money did not go into municipal bonds. It went directly into a private escrow account in the Cayman Islands to purchase Madison's summer villa in Aspen. Madison let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. August 3rd. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy, humid air. $1.8 million, diverted from a collective college savings trust. That capital was specifically used to pay off Madison's private shopper at Bergdorf Goodman and to cover the aggressive margin calls Kendrick triggered by shorting the airline industry. He gambled with your children's tuition money to fund her lifestyle. And just last Thursday, I added delivering the final fatal blow. Exactly $4.2 million vanished from the senior partner's retirement accounts. It was transferred through a labyrinth of shell companies to temporarily mask the massive liquidity crisis he is facing. He is running a sophisticated shadow ledger. He has been paying old investors with new investors' capital. Your golden boy is running a Ponzi scheme, and the bottom has officially dropped out. The atmosphere in the VIP dining room violently fractured. The gleeful, gossipy energy that had fueled the elite crowd evaporated instantly. It was replaced by the cold, suffocating grip of pure financial terror. The smartphones that had been eagerly recording the family drama were suddenly lowered. Bank executives scrambled to their feet, knocking over expensive crystal wine glasses and silver cutlery. Chairs screeched harshly against the floorboards as panic ignited like a wildfire. "Check your portfolios," I instructed the crowd, my voice ringing with lethal authority. "Call your brokers. Log into your secure financial portals right this very second. The quarterly statements you received last month were completely fabricated. The money is gone. You are all holding empty bags." Absolute chaos erupted. A chorus of frantic shouts filled the opulent dining hall. Men in tailored tuxedos began desperately dialing their phones, shouting over one another in sheer panic. Women gripped their husbands' arms, their faces twisted in horror. The illusion of safety and prestige had been violently ripped away, exposing the devastating reality of their ruined finances. Thomas stood frozen near his front row table. His broad shoulders were slumped, and his usually commanding, untouchable presence had utterly dissolved. He was the man who had vetted Kendrick. He was the one who had proudly vouched for his golden son-in-law, personally introducing him to half the wealthy investors in this very room. Thomas had staked his own immaculate reputation on Kendrick's financial brilliance. Now the collateral damage was closing in on him. A prominent local judge, a man who had invested his entire family fortune with Kendrick, based solely on Thomas's personal recommendation, shoved his way aggressively through the frantic crowd. His face was a mottled shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He did not go for Kendrick. He went straight for the patriarch. The judge lunged forward and grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, violently jerking the larger man forward. "Where the hell is my retirement fund?" Thomas the judge roared, shaking my father with terrifying force. The heavy silk of Thomas's tuxedo jacket bunched violently in the tight fists of the furious judge. The older man shook my father with a raw, terrifying strength that only comes from absolute desperation. Thomas gagged, his eyes bulging as the starched collar of his dress shirt dug sharply into his windpipe. "Let him go!" a woman screamed from the back of the room, but her voice was instantly drowned out by the erupting chaos. The polite, refined veneer of Atlanta's high society completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. These were people who defined their entire existence by their net worth. Without their portfolios, they were nothing. And the realization that they had been stripped of their wealth turned the elegant dining room into a feral feeding ground. A senior partner from a downtown law firm shoved past a waiter sending a tray of crystal water glasses, shattering across the hardwood floor. He lunged toward the stage, his face a twisted mask of pure rage, pointing an accusing finger at Kendrick. "You promised me guaranteed returns, you son of a bitch," the lawyer roared. "I trusted you with my family trust." Kendrick stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled champagne from Madison's shattered flute. He raised both hands in a weak defensive gesture, but he had absolutely no words left. His slick Wall Street vocabulary had abandoned him. "Get off me," Thomas bellowed finally, managing to pry the judge's hands from his lapels. He shoved the older man away, smoothing his ruined jacket with trembling hands. His broad chest heaved as he looked frantically around the room. He saw the angry mob closing in. He saw his lifelong friends, his golf partners, and his business associates transforming into a pack of starving wolves ready to tear him apart. Thomas did exactly what a cornered coward always does. He looked for a human shield. "Listen to me," Thomas yelled, his booming voice cutting through the immediate shouting. He raised both hands, palms facing outward, in a desperate plea for calm. "I did not know anything about this. I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind closed doors." He whipped his arm around and pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at Kendrick. "He lied to all of us," Thomas declared, his voice ringing with manufactured righteous indignation. "He is a rogue traitor. He manipulated the ledgers and kept me completely in the dark. I am a victim here just like the rest of you. He assured me the investments were secure. He assured me the margin calls were handled. I trusted my son-in-law and he betrayed my family just like he betrayed yours." Madison let out a horrified gasp. "Dad," she cried out, her voice cracking with sheer disbelief. "What are you doing? You cannot do this to him. You introduced him to these people." "Shut up, Madison." Thomas barked viciously, not even bothering to look at his daughter. He stepped further away from the stage, physically distancing himself from Kendrick's sinking ship. "He embezzled our money. He is a criminal. I will personally lead the lawsuit against his hedge fund. I will see him rot in a federal cell for what he has done to this community." Kendrick stared at his father-in-law, his jaw dropping in absolute shock. The impenetrable alliance between the two arrogant men dissolved instantly. "You hypocritical bastard," Kendrick spat, his voice shaking with furious disbelief. "You happily took the kickbacks, Thomas. You gladly took the offshore dividends to fund your real estate acquisitions. Do not act like you are an innocent bystander." While the two men viciously turned on each other, the matriarch of the family realized the battle was entirely lost. Brenda had been standing near the front table watching her husband publicly disown her daughter's husband. She saw the rage in the eyes of the women she had spent decades judging and belittling. She knew the lifestyle she worshipped was dead and buried. Brenda slowly backed away from her table. She clutched her designer evening bag tightly against her chest and kept her head down. She took soft, quiet steps, moving backward toward the heavy, swinging doors that led to the kitchen. She was abandoning her husband. She was abandoning her humiliated daughter. She just wanted to escape the room before the authorities arrived. She almost made it. "Where exactly do you think you are going, Brenda?" a sharp voice demanded. Brenda froze just 3 feet from the kitchen doors. The mayor's wife stepped directly into her path. Beside her stood the wife of the senior law partner and 2 other prominent socialites. They formed a solid physical barricade blocking the exit. "Get out of my way," Sylvia, Brenda demanded, trying to muster her usual arrogant tone. "I need to use the restroom." "You are not going anywhere," Sylvia replied, crossing her arms over her chest. The other women stepped closer, boxing Brenda in. "You are going to stand right here and explain how your family stole our children's trust funds. You are going to explain how you sat at my dining table last month bragging about your new Aspen villa while wearing clothes bought with my money." "I do not know anything about the finances," Brenda stammered, her voice shrinking as she backed up against the wall. "That is Thomas's department. I am just a wife. "You are a thief," the law partner's wife hissed, stepping directly into Brenda's personal space. "Take off that necklace, Brenda. If it was bought with our stolen capital, I want it back right now." The room was completely spiraling out of control. The shouting escalated into a deafening roar. Two men were physically restraining the judge who was trying to lunge at Thomas again. Madison was sobbing hysterically on the stage, begging Kendrick to fix it while Kendrick shouted matching threats back at Thomas. The beautiful elite country club had become a war zone. I stood quietly on the stage, absorbing the spectacular destruction of the people who had treated me like dirt my entire life. They were tearing each other to pieces. I could have easily stood there and let them finish the job, but I was not quite done with them yet. I bent down and picked up the heavy metal microphone that Madison had dropped on the wooden floorboards. I walked over to the nearest amplifier speaker and deliberately tapped the head of the microphone against the metal casing. A sharp, piercing crack of amplified sound fired through the dining room. The deafening noise forced everyone to stop shouting. The fighting ceased instantly as dozens of angry eyes snapped back toward the stage. The wealthy guests were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with rage, waiting to see what I would do next. I held the microphone up to my mouth, my expression perfectly serene. "Do not let Thomas play the victim," I announced, my voice carrying a smooth, lethal authority that commanded absolute silence. "He is not a bystander. He is not a victim of a rogue traitor. He is the mastermind." Thomas whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with a new, profound level of terror. "Riley," he warned, his voice trembling. "Shut your mouth." I walked over to the small cocktail table at the edge of the stage. I reached down and grabbed the brass latches of my sleek leather briefcase. The locks popped open with a loud, satisfying click. I pulled open the heavy leather flap of my briefcase and extracted a thick, pristine stack of federal banking documents. The sharp rustle of the thick paper echoed through the microphone, cutting through the violent shouting match happening on the dining room floor. Thomas did not just know about the illegal trading, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. He facilitated every single transaction. He provided the offshore infrastructure that made this entire massive theft possible. The judge, who was still gripping Thomas tightly by the collar, froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his chest heaving with exertion. "Let him go, Your Honor," I said, stepping down from the elevated stage. "Strangling him will not reverse the wire transfers. But these documents will ensure he spends the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary." I walked directly up to the furious judge and handed him the top file. It was a comprehensive financial ledger highlighting the exact flow of illicit capital. "Look at page 4, I instructed him calmly. "Look at the transaction dated October 12th. That is the exact day Kendrick liquidated your family trust. He did not lose your money in the market, Your Honor. He did not make a bad trade. He intentionally transferred $6.8 million of your retirement funds into a Cayman Island shell company called Obsidian Logistics." The judge snatched the papers from my hand. He shoved his reading glasses onto his face with trembling fingers. I watched his eyes scan the rows of highlighted routing numbers and swift codes. His breathing became incredibly shallow as the devastating reality of the numbers sank in. "Obsidian Logistics is a phantom entity," I explained, projecting my voice so every terrified investor in the room could hear the exact mechanics of their ruin. "It has no employees. It has no physical office. It is a paper shield registered under Thomas's primary real estate holding group. Kendrick funneled your liquid assets into Thomas's failing commercial properties to artificially inflate his portfolio valuations." Thomas staggered backward, his face a mask of sheer panic. "She is lying," he croaked, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "These documents are forged. This is corporate sabotage. They are bank-certified wire transfer receipts." Thomas shot back, holding up another stack of heavily stamped papers. "I have the IP addresses that authorize the transfers. I have the digital signatures of your personal compliance officers. I have the registration deeds for every single shell company you and Kendrick established to launder this stolen capital. You engaged in a systematic conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, and securities fraud." I turned to the crowd of panicked socialites and banking executives. When Kendrick's highly leveraged derivative trades went underwater, he needed an immediate influx of cash to cover his aggressive margin calls. Thomas provided the illusion of liquidity. They executed fictitious consulting contracts between the hedge fund and the real estate firm. They bled your portfolios dry to pay off their own catastrophic debts and to maintain their luxurious lifestyles. The room was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. These were the elite power players of the city, and they had been played for absolute fools by two men they implicitly trusted. "This is a textbook Ponzi scheme," I declared, staring directly at my father. "You were paying off early investors with capital stolen from the new ones. But you ran out of fresh money, Thomas. The market shifted and your fraudulent conveyance completely collapsed." The judge looked up from the papers. His hands were shaking so violently the pages rustled like dry leaves. He looked at Thomas with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "My grandchildren's college funds were in that trust," the judge whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. "You looked me in the eye at the country club charity gala, and you swore my assets were secured." "I did not know," Thomas gasped, taking another clumsy step backward. "I trusted Kendrick. He managed the accounts. Your signature is on the Cayman Island Incorporation documents," Thomas the Furry stated ruthlessly, shutting down his final pathetic lie. "You are the sole beneficiary of the offshore accounts. You violated every single statute of the Investment Advisors Act. You breached your fiduciary duty to every person standing in this room." Thomas looked around the VIP dining room. He saw the furious bank executives reaching for their cell phones to call their legal teams. He saw the mayor's wife glaring at him with pure, unhidden hatred. He saw the total evaporation of the empire he had spent a lifetime building on the backs of others. Suddenly, Thomas's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickening shade of gray. His broad chest began to heave erratically. He reached up with a trembling hand and grabbed the fabric of his starched shirt right over his heart. "My chest," Thomas wheezed, his knees buckling slightly. "I cannot breathe." He swayed heavily, clutching his chest in a desperate performance of a severe medical emergency. He was hoping for sympathy. He was hoping the crowd would rush forward to help him, allowing the focus to shift away from his massive financial crimes. But nobody moved. Not a single person in that room stepped forward to catch him. The wealthy investors simply backed away, treating him like a diseased animal. They watched him struggle with cold, detached fury. Even Brenda, his own wife, remained frozen near the kitchen doors, refusing to run to his side. "Save the theatrics, Thomas," I said, my voice devoid of any pity. "The paramedics can check your blood pressure after the federal agents read you your Miranda rights." I submitted the full whistleblower dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago. They have already frozen your domestic accounts. The FBI is currently seizing the servers at your corporate headquarters. Madison, who had been watching her entire reality disintegrate from the stage, finally broke. She scrambled down the wooden steps, her designer heels skidding wildly. She lunged toward Kendrick, grabbing the lapels of his expensive suit. Her perfect blowout was a tangled mess, and her heavy makeup was streaked with desperate tears. "Tell them it is a lie," Kendrick Madison sobbed, shaking her husband frantically. "Tell them we have the money." Kendrick did not answer his weeping wife. He simply stood there, staring blankly over her shoulder at the heavy oak doors of the dining room, visualizing the federal agents he knew were already coming to dismantle his life. His dead silence was the final devastating confirmation. Madison let out a guttural, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the floor of the VIP dining room. She buried her face in her hands, her massive diamond rings glittering uselessly under the crystal chandeliers. I stepped over to the edge of the wooden stage, looking past the sobbing Madison, to where Thomas was still slumped heavily against a cocktail table. His fabricated heart attack had failed to garner even an ounce of sympathy from the furious crowd. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes were darting rapidly around the room, desperately calculating his dwindling odds of survival. "You are probably wondering why Thomas invited me here tonight," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the low, rumbling panic of the ruined investors. "I am the estranged daughter, the outcast, the woman he publicly disowned 5 years ago because I refused to be a silent pawn in his corrupt real estate empire." "So why the sudden olive branch?" Why the lavish dinner invitation and the front row seat to this family spectacle? Thomas stiffened. He locked eyes with me, his face twisting with a fresh wave of primal panic. Riley, do not say another word, he warned, his voice a raspy, desperate whisper. Earlier this evening, Thomas pulled me into a private hallway. I continued ignoring his pathetic command entirely. He slapped me across the face hard enough to leave a mark. Then he shoved a manila folder into my chest and ordered me to sign a legal waiver. He told me it was a standard family administrative document. He claimed it was a minor formality to restructure a dormant holding company. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the crumpled manila folder Thomas had handed me hours ago. I held it up high for the entire room to see. This is not an administrative waiver, I announced. This is a total relinquishment of beneficiary rights. This document would have legally transferred absolute control of my late grandmother's irrevocable trust directly to Thomas. Brenda suddenly lunged forward from her position near the kitchen doors, abandoning her cowardly attempt to sneak out of the building. Her face was contorted with pure hysterical rage. "Shut your mouth, Riley!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking sharply in the humid air. "You are ruining everything. You are destroying your own family out of spite. Someone make her shut up." No one moved to stop me. The private security guards remained frozen. The wealthy guests were captivated by the sheer horror of the unfolding truth, and the mayor was still recording every single second on his smartphone. "I am not destroying anything, Brenda," I replied, my tone dangerously calm and razor-sharp. "I am just reading the autopsy report. You see, my grandmother was the only person in this family with actual integrity. She knew exactly what Thomas was capable of. That is why she placed her wealth in an ironclad trust, heavily insulated from his corporate accounts. It is a completely pristine, untainted reservoir of liquid assets. And more importantly, it is not flagged by the Securities and Exchange Commission." I looked down at Thomas, who was now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were bone white. "Your shadow ledgers were imploding," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "The SEC subpoena was already in the mail. You and Kendrick had completely drained the investor portfolios. The shell companies in the Cayman Islands were tapped out. You needed untraceable liquidity to keep the federal auditors off your backs for just one more week. You needed clean cash to finalize your escape to a non-extradition country before the feds froze your passports. And my grandmother's trust fund was the very last untouched piggy bank you had left." The room erupted in fresh murmurs of profound disgust. The regional bank executives who had previously idolized Thomas were now looking at him like a rotting corpse. "He needed my signature to legally authorize the wire transfer," I explained, letting the cold, hard truth sink into the minds of the furious crowd. "Without my explicit consent, the bank would not release the funds. He tried to bully me. He tried to physically intimidate me. He thought I was still the scared little girl who would blindly obey his commands to keep the peace. He had absolutely no idea that I already knew his entire financial empire was a hollow, rotting shell." "You are a liar!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. Her emerald necklace shook wildly against her collarbone. "We are wealthy. We are the elite of this city. You are just a jealous, bitter little girl making up stories because you could never fit in with us." "Wealthy," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Let us talk about your wealth, Brenda. Let us talk about the reality behind the designer dresses and the exclusive country club memberships. Because my forensic accounting team audited your personal accounts too." Brenda froze, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You do not own a single thing in this world," I stated, my words dropping like heavy anvils. "This prestigious country club membership. It is 3 months in arrears. The luxury cars you drove here tonight. They are leased through Kendrick's fraudulent hedge fund, and the repossession orders were officially filed yesterday afternoon. Your sprawling estate in Buckhead. It carries 3 separate, heavily leveraged mortgages, and you have missed the last 4 payments. Your platinum credit cards are completely maxed out. Your personal checking accounts are severely overdrawn." I watched Brenda's arrogant facade shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She staggered backward, clapping a shaking hand over her mouth. You are bankrupt, Brenda, I said mercilessly, delivering the final absolute truth. You are completely, utterly penniless. By tomorrow morning, you will not even be able to afford a cup of coffee. The federal government is going to seize every piece of jewelry you are wearing. They are going to seize your imported shoes. They are going to seize the very clothes on your back to pay restitution to the innocent people you and your husband robbed. The VIP dining room was suffocatingly silent. The grand illusion was dead. The mighty Thomas and Brenda were exposed as nothing more than desperate thieves living on stolen, borrowed time. On the floor near the stage, Madison scrambled to her feet. She looked wildly from her thoroughly humiliated mother to her utterly ruined father. The reality of her sudden absolute poverty crashed over her. Her parents could not save her. Her trust fund was gone. Her entire identity had been erased in a matter of minutes. She spun around and grabbed Kendrick's arm again, digging her manicured nails deeply into his expensive jacket. "Fix this, Kendrick." Madison begged, her voice a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "Call your lawyers. Call your offshore bankers. Do something. You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me I would never have to worry about money. Fix it right now." Kendrick looked down at his wife. The panicked, frantic energy in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hollow realization that his life as a free man was officially over. He looked at her tear-streaked face, her ruined makeup, and her desperate clutching hands. He did not see a loving partner. He saw the very reason he had pushed his massive fraud to the absolute breaking point. Kendrick sneered, his lip curling with utter disgust, and forcefully shoved her hand away. The violent motion sent Madison stumbling backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the stage. She barely managed to stay on her feet, staring at the man she called her husband with wide, terrified eyes. "Do not touch me!" Kendrick hissed, his voice a low, venomous growl that carried across the dead, silent room. "Do not ever put your hands on me again." Madison trembled, her lips parting but no sound coming out. The charismatic, charming man who had swept her off her feet, the man who had bought her diamonds and chartered private jets to Paris, was completely gone. In his place stood a cornered, ruthless predator who had just realized his prey was useless to him. "Fix it." Madison finally choked out a fresh wave of tears, ruining her pristine makeup. "You are my husband, Kendrick. You are supposed to protect me. You promised we were building an empire." "An empire?" Kendrick laughed, a harsh, grating sound that lacked any trace of humor. "You actually believed that nonsense. You actually thought I married you for love." The words struck Madison like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around her own stomach as if trying to hold herself together. "Let me explain something to you, Madison," Kendrick said, stepping down from the stage and backing her into the center of the VIP dining room floor. The wealthy guests formed a tight circle around them, too mesmerized by the spectacular domestic destruction to look away. "I never loved you. I never even liked you. You were nothing but a business transaction. You were the agonizingly steep price of admission I had to pay to get access to your father's endless pipeline of capital." Thomas let out a strangled noise from the corner, where he was still clutching his chest, but Kendrick ignored him entirely. He kept his predatory gaze locked on his weeping wife, mercilessly tearing apart every single illusion she had ever held about her perfect life. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it has been pretending to care about your vapid, empty existence?" Kendrick demanded, stepping closer. "Listening to you whine about the country club seating arrangements, pretending to be interested in your overpriced Pilates classes and your endless shopping trips to Bergdorf Goodman. You are a walking, talking parasite, Madison. You produce absolutely nothing of value. You just consume and consume and consume." "I am your wife," she sobbed, dropping to her knees. Her legs could no longer support her. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive silk gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. "I gave you everything. You gave me a headache," Kendrick spat, staring down at her crumpled form with pure, unfiltered contempt. "I needed a human shield and you were stupid enough to volunteer. I needed a clean name to put on the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Do you really think it was a romantic gesture when I named the offshore holding group after your maiden name? It was a legal firewall. You signed hundreds of blank financial ledgers over the past 4 years without ever once asking to read the fine print. You were the perfect idiot, Madison. You never questioned the math because you were too busy spending the stolen money. Madison covered her ears, her shoulders heaving as she let out a long, agonizing wail. Her entire universe had just been obliterated. The golden marriage, the untouchable social status, the endless stream of luxury, it was all a meticulously crafted lie designed to use her as a scapegoat. She was not a queen, she was the fall guy. That is enough, Brenda screamed suddenly, charging through the circle of stunned investors. The matriarch could no longer watch her favorite daughter be publicly verbally slaughtered. Brenda lunged at Kendrick, her face twisted into a mask of pure feral rage. She raised her right hand, aiming a vicious, open-palm slap directly at Kendrick's face. But Kendrick was faster. He did not flinch. He simply raised his arm and caught Brenda's wrist mid-air. His grip was absolute and punishing. Brenda gasped in pain, struggling wildly to free her arm, but Kendrick held her firmly in place. The emeralds on her necklace clattered against her chest as she writhed helplessly against his physical strength. "Let go of me, you monster," Brenda shrieked, her pristine socialite image completely forgotten. "You are a sociopath." "I am exactly what you and Thomas ordered," Kendrick replied, leaning in close to Brenda's face. "You did not want a good man for your daughter. You wanted a shiny new hood ornament for your country club dinners. You practically sold her to me because I had a fancy title and a Wall Street pedigree. You ignored every single red flag because I paid for your kitchen renovations and your imported cars. So do not stand here and act like a protective mother, Brenda. You are just mad that your personal ATM machine is broken." He forcefully shoved Brenda's arm away, sending the older woman stumbling back until she crashed into a cocktail table. She gripped the edges of the table, gasping for breath, her eyes darting frantically toward Thomas, who was still uselessly leaning against the far wall. The room was silent, save for Madison's ragged, uncontrollable sobbing on the floor. The bank executives, the local judge, the mayor, they all just watched. The mighty family had completely devoured itself. Kendrick adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, regaining a terrifying clinical composure. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen rapidly, his eyes tracking a series of digital numbers. "What are you doing?" Thomas demanded, finding a fraction of his voice. "The FBI is outside Kendrick. It is over." "It is over for you," Kendrick corrected, his thumb flying across the glowing screen of his phone. "I am transferring what is left of the offshore emergency reserves to a decentralized, untraceable crypto account. The feds can have the shell companies, they can have the empty portfolios, and they can certainly have all of you." Kendrick looked up from his phone, his eyes cold and dead. "I am leaving," he announced. "You people are dead to me." Kendrick's thumb hammered against the illuminated glass screen of his smartphone. The harsh blue light of the offshore banking portal reflected in his wide, frantic eyes. He hit the refresh icon, dragging his finger down the screen with a violent jerk. A small loading circle spun endlessly in the center of the display, mocking his rising panic. He typed in a 12-digit alphanumeric bypass code, his hands shaking so badly he missed a keystroke and had to start over. He cursed under his breath, a rapid string of foul words that completely shattered whatever remained of his refined Wall Street facade. The wealthy patrons surrounding us did not intervene. The regional bank executives, the furious judge, and the betrayed socialites formed a tight barricade around the room, watching the architect of their financial ruin desperately attempt to flee with their last remaining scraps of capital. They were paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it. He was trying to rob them in real time right in front of their faces. I did not interrupt him. I let him experience the excruciating agony of hope being systematically crushed. I slowly raised my left arm, allowing the heavy sleeve of my tailored blazer to slide back. I glanced down at the face of my gold Cartier watch. It was a beautiful piece, a gift I had purchased for myself the day Aegis Financial Forensics secured its first major federal contract. The elegant black hands ticked forward with flawless mechanical precision. I watched the second hand sweep across the dial, tracking the exact moment Kendrick's entire universe collapsed into dust. Kendrick hit the side of the phone against his palm as if physical force could bypass international banking protocols. His chest began to heave. He ripped his bespoke silk tie completely off his neck, letting it fall carelessly to the hardwood floor. He unbuttoned the top of his starched collar, gasping for air, as if the massive dining room had suddenly run out of oxygen. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. He was hyperventilating, the sheer terror of his reality triggering a massive physiological response. Sweat dripped from his chin, landing on the glowing screen of his device. Authentication denied, Kendrick whispered, reading the bright red text that flashed across his screen. His voice was raw and trembling. He tapped the secondary account portal, his fingers slipping on the glass. Error. Assets unavailable. I let my arm drop back to my side and offered Kendrick a perfectly polite, razor-thin smile. Looking for the Cayman accounts, I asked, my voice echoing effortlessly through the dead-silent dining room. He snapped his head up, staring at me with the wild, desperate eyes of a trapped animal. The arrogance was completely gone, stripped away to reveal the cowardly, fraudulent thief hiding underneath. I had a federal judge freeze them at exactly 6 o'clock this morning, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute clinical precision. Every single offshore account, every hidden shell company, every phantom crypto wallet you thought you successfully encrypted behind 3 layers of proxy servers. We tracked the digital footprint back to your original IP address, Kendrick. The Department of Justice filed a global asset freeze before you even put on your tuxedo tonight. Kendrick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. You cannot liquidate the Obsidian logistics accounts, I explained mercilessly, breaking down the exact mechanics of his defeat. You cannot access the Vanguard holding trusts. The international wire transfers have been permanently blocked by the SWIFT network, under direct orders from federal enforcement. You cannot move a single cent, Kendrick. You have exactly $0. The smartphone slipped from his slick, sweaty fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, loud crack, the glass screen spiderwebbing into 1,000 tiny fractures. Kendrick did not even try to pick it up. He did not try to run. He just stared down at the broken device as if looking at his own severed head. His knees buckled slightly and he slumped against the edge of the stage, utterly hollowed out. The crowd of investors let out a collective breath. The finality of the moment washed over the room. The money was truly gone, but the man who stole it had been completely neutralized. He was not escaping to a tropical island. He was going to a federal penitentiary. From the corner of the room, Thomas pushed himself off the cocktail table. His breathing had leveled out, but his eyes were completely wild. The physical facade of his fabricated heart attack had vanished, replaced by a severe psychological break. He looked at Kendrick's shattered phone. He looked at Madison weeping uncontrollably on the floor, her silk dress ruined. He looked at Brenda trembling against the wall, stripped of her wealth and her elite social standing. Then Thomas looked at me. He stared at the daughter he had deemed utterly worthless, the daughter he had publicly humiliated and discarded, the daughter who had just systematically dismantled his entire corrupt empire in less than an hour without ever raising her voice. A strange, strangled noise escaped Thomas's throat. It started as a low, wet cough. Then it morphed into a harsh, rhythmic chuckle. His chest hitched as the sound grew louder, vibrating in the back of his throat. Within seconds, Thomas threw his head back and began to laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a loud, booming, maniacal laugh that bounced terrifyingly off the mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers. It was the sound of a man whose mind had completely and permanently snapped under the crushing weight of his own hubris. He laughed at his ruined legacy. He laughed at his bankrupt wife. He laughed at the furious judge who was dialing the police. The wealthy guests backed away from him in horror, watching the patriarch of Atlanta's elite society descend into absolute madness. Thomas clutched his stomach, his laughter echoing endlessly over the sound of approaching sirens wailing in the distance. Thomas's laughter did not taper off into a sob or a gasp of despair. Instead, it hardened. The manic, chaotic edge sharpened into something much more terrifying. It became a cold, calculated chuckle. He dropped his hand from his chest, entirely abandoning the pathetic charade of a cardiac event. He stood up perfectly straight, towering over the shattered remnants of his family. He looked down at Kendrick, who was still slumped on the floor, staring at his broken phone. Thomas kicked the shattered device across the room with the toe of his Italian leather shoe. The sharp clatter of the phone hitting the mahogany baseboard made several of the frozen investors flinch. "You always were a small-minded amateur," Kendrick Thomas sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You panic over a few frozen offshore accounts. You crumble because a little girl managed to file an injunction. You have absolutely no vision. You thought marrying my daughter made you my equal, but you are nothing but a bottom-feeding parasite who cracked at the first sign of real pressure." Thomas turned his gaze back to me. The panic that had gripped him just minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was a terrifying, unshakable arrogance. He reached up and calmly adjusted the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles with practiced precision. He rolled his shoulders back, taking a deep breath of the heavy air as if he owned the very oxygen in the room. "You think you have won," Riley Thomas said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the stage. He walked right past the furious regional bank executives as if they were nothing more than invisible statues. "You think freezing those Cayman accounts means anything to me? You think exposing this little shell game is going to put me in a federal penitentiary?" He let out another sharp laugh, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are just like your mother used to be before she learned how the real world operates. You are painfully naive. You look at a few missing millions and you think it is the end of the world. You play with pennies while I play with empires." The room remained paralyzed. The sheer audacity of his confidence was mesmerizing. The Securities and Exchange Commission was en route, the FBI was seizing his corporate servers, and yet Thomas stood in the center of the VIP dining room, acting like a king who had just secured his throne. The furious crowd of socialites and executives exchanged uneasy glances, the certainty of their righteous anger suddenly faltering in the face of his absolute lack of fear. "You want to talk about my shadow ledgers?" Riley Thomas challenged, raising his voice so the entire room could hear his grand declaration. "Let us talk about tomorrow morning. Let us talk about 9 o'clock tomorrow morning when the market opens." He looked around at the terrified investors, his lips curling into a triumphant, mocking smirk. "You fools are crying over a few missing millions. You should be down on your knees thanking me for carrying your dead weight for this long. Tomorrow morning, my real estate holding group is finalizing a massive multi-billion-dollar merger with Vanguard Equities." A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd of banking executives. Vanguard Equities was a global titan, a financial behemoth that swallowed entire industries whole. They were the biggest player in the commercial real estate sector, and their legal and financial power was practically limitless. "The contracts are already drawn," Thomas bragged, spreading his arms wide as if soaking in the awe of his audience. "The due diligence is completely finished. Vanguard is absorbing my entire commercial portfolio to anchor their expansion into the Southeast. They are injecting $4.2 billion of pure, unadulterated capital directly into my corporate infrastructure." He pointed a thick finger directly at my chest, his eyes burning with toxic triumph. "Do you understand what that means, Riley? It means I am legally and financially untouchable. Vanguard's legal department is a private army. Once I am under their corporate umbrella, the SEC will not even dare to look in my direction. They will bury your little whistleblower dossier in decades of corporate litigation. I will pay off these pathetic investors with the loose change in my pocket to keep them quiet, and I will walk away a billionaire." The realization washed over the room like a tidal wave of ice water. The investors who had been ready to tear him apart just moments ago now looked at each other in stunned, uncertain silence. If Thomas was telling the truth, he was about to become too big to fail. The federal government rarely prosecuted billionaires who had the backing of a conglomerate like Vanguard. The stolen money would be replaced, the ledgers would be magically balanced, and Thomas would escape completely unscathed. Brenda, who had been cowering against the cocktail table, suddenly stood up straight. The color rushed back into her pale face. The terrifying prospect of losing her Buckhead mansion, her imported cars, and her country club status instantly evaporated. She looked at her husband and saw her luxurious parasitic lifestyle fully securely restored. She smoothed down the fabric of her expensive silk dress and stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Thomas. The toxic, unified front of my parents was back in place, an impenetrable wall of elitist arrogance. She completely ignored Madison, who was still sobbing on the floor. Her golden child was no longer useful, so she simply stepped over her. Brenda looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. "You really thought you could destroy us?" Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "You thought your little accounting tricks could take down this family. We are the elite, Riley. We operate on a level you cannot even comprehend." She reached out and linked her arm through Thomas's, her diamond bracelets flashing under the crystal chandeliers. She wiped a single stray tear from her cheek, making a show of recovering her flawless composure. "You are just a bitter, jealous little girl playing a game you do not understand," Brenda continued, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "You wanted to embarrass us tonight, but all you did was prove exactly why we cut you out of our lives. You could never measure up to our standards. You are nothing but a disappointment." Brenda tilted her chin up, flashing me a vicious, triumphant smirk. "You lose, you little brat." Thomas let out another booming laugh, wrapping his arms securely around his wife's waist. "Go home, Riley." He dismissed me, waving his free hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Go back to your mediocre life, read the Wall Street Journal tomorrow morning, and watch me ascend to a level of power you will never even brush against." I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply stood at the edge of the stage and watched them revel in their magnificent delusion. I let them soak in the absolute certainty of their untouchable wealth. I let them taste the multi-billion-dollar victory they thought they had securely locked away. Then the heavy oak double doors of the VIP dining room swung open with a deafening, violent crash. The massive wooden doors slammed against the walls, echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. Every single head in the dining room snapped toward the entrance. A chillingly calm female voice echoed through the space, slicing through Thomas's arrogant laughter like a razor blade. "There will be no merger, Thomas." The maniacal booming laughter died instantly in Thomas's throat. He choked on his own breath, a sudden violent spasm racking his chest. The heavy wooden doors rebounded against the mahogany walls, sending a shockwave of silence rolling through the humid air of the dining room. Every single head snapped toward the entrance. The regional bank executives, the furious judge, the ruined socialites, and the paralyzed security guards all turned to face the threshold. 6 men and women stepped into the room in perfect, terrifying unison. They wore impeccably tailored, razor-sharp suits, holding thick leather briefcases with clinical detachment. They moved like a phalanx of corporate predators, a highly synchronized private army. Then the woman who commanded them walked through the center of the formation. It was Caroline, my biological mother. The visual contrast between the two women in Thomas's life was jarring and absolute. Brenda was standing near the cocktail table, dripping in frantic, tacky desperation. She wore a bright, gaudy silk gown that clung to her sweating frame. Her hair was stiff with excessive hairspray, and a heavy emerald necklace dug awkwardly into her collarbone. She looked like a woman desperately trying to scream her wealth at a room that no longer cared. Caroline was the complete and total antithesis of that loud insecurity. She radiated a lethal, quiet power. She wore a simple, unstructured charcoal cashmere suit that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She wore absolutely no flashy jewelry, just a vintage leather-banded watch on her left wrist. Her silver hair was pulled back into a sleek, elegant twist. She did not need to scream to command the room. Her mere presence sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the VIP dining room. She moved with the fluid, graceful certainty of someone who owned the very ground she walked on. Thomas's face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickening, translucent gray. The unshakable arrogance he had flaunted just seconds ago evaporated into thin air. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping harshly against the polished floorboards. He took one step, then another, then a third. He hit the edge of a cocktail table and froze completely, his mouth hanging open like a suffocated fish. On the floor, Madison abruptly stopped her hysterical wailing. She wiped her streaked mascara with a trembling hand, staring up at the imposing figure walking down the center aisle. Madison's eyes were wide and uncomprehending, her perfect world completely shattered by the arrival of a woman she had been taught to view as a pathetic failure. The crowd of elite socialites and furious bankers parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled backward, bumping into chairs and tables, desperately creating a wide, clear path for Caroline. The pure, unfiltered authority radiating from her and her legal team demanded absolute submission. Caroline walked with a slow, measured cadence. Every single click of her understated heels sounded like a countdown to execution. Her eyes were locked entirely on Thomas, ignoring the whispers and gasps echoing through the stunned crowd. Brenda, realizing her husband was completely paralyzed by a terror she could not comprehend, tried to step up. She puffed out her chest, attempting to summon her fading country club superiority. "Who do you think you are?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill and trembling wildly in the quiet room. "You cannot just barge into a private event. Security removed this woman immediately." The private guards did not even twitch. They remained glued to the walls, entirely intimidated by the federal agents and corporate lawyers standing at the entrance. Caroline did not even look at Brenda. She treated the screaming woman like a piece of ugly, irrelevant furniture. She kept her piercing gaze locked squarely on her ex-husband. Thomas tried to speak. He tried to summon his blustering corporate bravado to defend his crumbling empire. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just made a pathetic grasping motion with his right hand, pulling at his starched collar as if he were actually choking. Caroline reached the elevated wooden stage and effortlessly climbed the 2 steps. She walked directly over to me and stopped. We stood shoulder to shoulder facing the ruined patriarch. The physical resemblance between us was undeniable to everyone in the room. We shared the same sharp jawline, the same steady posture, and the same unbothered, calculating gaze. "You have spent the last 20 years telling everyone in this city that I was a destitute failure," Caroline said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and absolutely devastating. It carried effortlessly across the room, slicing through his remaining dignity. "You told your investors that I begged you for alimony after our divorce. You told your pathetic new wife that I was living in miserable obscurity. You meticulously built a grand narrative where you were the brilliant titan of industry, and I was just the tragic, discarded first wife who could not handle your massive success." Thomas swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat tracing down his gray cheek. He gripped the edge of the cocktail table, his knuckles turning bone white. "Caroline," he choked out, his voice barely a raspy squeak. "What are you doing here? The Vanguard merger. It is a sealed contract. We finalized the terms. You cannot interfere with this. This is federal corporate business." Caroline smiled. It was the exact same razor-thin, polite smile I had given Kendrick moments earlier. A smile devoid of any warmth or mercy. She turned her head slightly, looking out over the crowd of stunned regional bank executives and ruined socialites, allowing the absolute finality of the moment to hang heavy in the humid air. Then she locked her piercing gaze back onto her terrified ex-husband. "I am not interfering," Caroline stated, her words dropping with the heavy, lethal finality of a guillotine. "Hello, Thomas. Meet the CEO of Vanguard Equities." "You actually thought Vanguard sought you out because your commercial portfolio was valuable," Caroline said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "Your portfolio is a toxic wasteland of over-leveraged debt. I instructed my acquisitions team to court you. I artificially inflated your valuation to make you commit every last liquid asset you had left to this merger. I wanted you to feel completely secure right before I dismantled you." "Why?" Thomas gasped, his voice cracking. He looked between me and Caroline, his eyes wild with terror. "Why go to this extreme? It was just a divorce. It was just a business separation. Why do this to me?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caroline's polished corporate exterior gave way to the fierce protective rage of a mother who had waited decades for justice. 24 years ago," Caroline said, her voice vibrating with lethal intensity. Thomas flinched as if he had been struck. 24 years ago," Caroline continued, stepping down from the stage to stand eye to eye with him. "I received a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was from a payphone at Atlanta International Airport. Gate 42. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to physically block out the memory. It was my 9-year-old daughter, Caroline stated, gesturing toward me without breaking eye contact with Thomas. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She was terrified. She told me you had promised to take her to Paris for her birthday, but when you got to the gate, you handed her your credit card, told her to buy a magazine, and walked onto a flight with your mistress. You left a 9-year-old girl alone at Gate 42 because she was an inconvenience to your affair. The wealthy guests and banking executives in the room gasped, staring at Thomas with open, unfiltered disgust. I drove 2 hours to the airport, Caroline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet cadence. I found her sitting on the floor, clutching her small suitcase, waiting for a father who was never coming back. I held her while she cried until she fell asleep in my arms. Caroline took one final step toward Thomas, invading his personal space. He shrank away, terrified of the quiet fury radiating from her. I made a promise to myself that night, Thomas. Caroline whispered, her words echoing loudly in the dead silent room. I vowed that I would build a machine so massive, so powerful, and so ruthless that it would eventually swallow you whole. Every company I bought, every rival I crushed, every billion I added to my net worth was for this exact moment. I built Vanguard equities just to crush you. Thomas's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing hard on his knees right in front of Caroline. The arrogant titan of Atlanta real estate was completely broken, reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess. Caroline, please, Thomas begged, reaching out to grasp the hem of her cashmere coat. She stepped back instantly, refusing to let him touch her. Please, the SEC is going to lock me up. The investors are going to ruin me. I will go to prison. We can negotiate. We can make a deal. I will sign everything over to you. Just finalize the merger, please. He was weeping, the tears streaming down his gray, wrinkled face. He clasped his hands together in a desperate prayer. I will give you anything you want, Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Just name your price. Caroline looked down at him with absolute indifference. I already have everything. She raised her left hand. One of the sharp-suited corporate lawyers immediately stepped forward. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of documents bound in heavy black cardstock. It was the Vanguard merger agreement, the contract that represented Thomas's salvation, his freedom, and his empire. The lawyer handed the thick stack of paper to Caroline. Thomas looked up at the documents, his eyes wide with desperate, animalistic hope. He reached his hands up toward the papers like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Caroline gripped the top of the bound contracts. With one swift, violent motion, she ripped the thick stack of documents entirely in half. The sound of tearing paper was loud and crisp, echoing like a final judgment through the dining room. Thomas let out a strangled, breathless cry. Caroline opened her hands and let the shredded halves of the Vanguard merger fall. The torn papers fluttered through the air, landing directly at Thomas's feet, burying his expensive leather shoes in the confetti of his ruined empire. The heavy silence in the room was absolute. The torn pieces of the Vanguard merger settled over Thomas's expensive leather shoes like snow on a fresh grave. No one breathed. No one moved. The entire room of elite socialites and banking executives remained entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction they had just witnessed. I stepped off the stage and stood directly beside my mother. The physical proximity between us felt like a fortress of unyielding power. We were a united front of absolute financial execution. I looked down at the man who had tormented me for my entire life, and I felt the last lingering threads of childhood fear dissolve into nothingness. Let us break down the reality of your tomorrow morning. Thomas, I said. My voice did not shake. It carried the crisp, clinical authority of an absolute victor. Do you know what happens when a merger of this magnitude evaporates overnight? The market does not just correct itself, it panics. And thanks to the forensic audit I hand-delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning, they already know exactly why Vanguard backed out. Caroline smoothed the lapel of her cashmere coat with a terrifying serenity. Your entire commercial real estate portfolio was leveraged against my acquisition, Thomas. You used our signed letter of intent to secure massive short-term bridge loans from the very bankers standing in this room just to keep your fraudulent shell companies from collapsing. On cue, several of the regional bank executives physically recoiled. They reached into their tailored pockets, pulling out their smartphones with frantic urgency. I watched them furiously tapping out messages to their risk management departments, initiating the immediate freezing of Thomas's corporate credit lines right there on the dining room floor. Those bridge loans default the exact second Vanguard publicly formally withdraws from the deal. I stated mercilessly, hammering the final nails into his coffin. And Vanguard just withdrew. Which means you are no longer just facing a liquidity crisis. You are legally entirely insolvent. You owe your creditors exactly $412 million that simply do not exist. Your Cayman accounts are frozen. Your domestic assets are built on fabricated ledgers. You have nothing. By 9 in the morning, Caroline continued, her voice as sharp as cut glass. Every single domestic account attached to your name will be seized. The deed to your Buckhead mansion will be locked by the collateral holders. The imported luxury vehicles your wife parades around the city will be towed directly out of your circular driveway. You will not have enough liquid capital to hire a defense attorney, let alone buy a cup of coffee. The reality of his absolute destitution finally penetrated Thomas's manic delusion. The arrogant billionaire facade shattered completely. His knees buckled under his weight. He dropped heavily to the hardwood floor, landing right on top of the shredded Vanguard contracts. The physical collapse of his massive ego was stunning to witness. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. He crawled toward Caroline like a beaten animal, his hands shaking violently as he reached out toward her shoes. "Caroline, please," Thomas sobbed. The sound was wet and pathetic, a desperate gagging whine that echoed horribly in the quiet room. "I am begging you. You have billions of dollars. You can spare something. Just a loan. 50 million, 20 million. Just give me enough to cover the immediate margin calls so I do not go to federal prison. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the company over to you. I will sign the house over to you. Just do not let them lock me in a cage." Caroline looked down at the weeping man grasping at the air near her feet. She did not kick him. She did not yell. She simply treated him as if he were entirely invisible. She turned her head and looked at me instead, a genuine warmth finally entering her piercing eyes. "You did exceptional work with that audit, Riley. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of the brilliant woman you have become." Realizing Caroline was an impenetrable wall of ice, Thomas frantically pivoted his crawling body toward me. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my dress, his tears dripping onto the pristine fabric. "Riley, please." He begged, his face contorted in absolute terror. "I am your father. You have to help me. I gave you life. You cannot let your own flesh and blood rot in a penitentiary. Please call the SEC. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the audit was wrong." I looked down at his tear-streaked face. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual familial loyalty, just the clean, sterile satisfaction of long-awaited justice. "You ceased being my father 24 years ago at Gate 42. I said, my voice empty of all emotion. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling my dress out of his sweaty, desperate grasp. "I am just the whistleblower." Behind him, Brenda let out a sharp, terrifying wail. She looked wildly around the room, realizing her elite status was dead. Her credit cards were already worthless pieces of plastic. She lunged toward Kendrick, who was still sitting on the edge of the stage, demanding he do something to fix this. But Kendrick just pushed her away, completely hollowed out by his own impending ruin. The entire family structure had collapsed into a pit of vipers, turning on each other in the dark. Then the heavy mahogany walls of the dining room began to pulse. A rhythmic flashing glow spilled through the tall, arched windows, cutting sharply through the dim, elegant lighting of the country club. Red and blue, red and blue. The piercing shriek of approaching sirens sliced through the heavy, humid air, growing louder and more aggressive by the second. The strobe effect of the police cruisers painted the dining room in harsh alternating hues of crimson and sapphire. The wail of the sirens cut off abruptly, replaced by the heavy synchronized thud of tactical boots marching up the grand stone steps of the country club. The paralysis in the room shattered into pure, unfiltered panic. The remaining mahogany door was shoved open with brutal force. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with stark yellow lettering flooded into the space. The FBI and the IRS had arrived, and they moved with a terrifying practiced efficiency. The elite socialites and furious banking executives did not just step aside. They scrambled. They pressed their backs against the expensive silk wallpaper, abandoning their cocktail glasses, pulling their spouses out of the way, and parting like the Red Sea. They created a wide, completely unobstructed path from the entrance directly to the center of the room. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. A tall, broad-shouldered lead agent with a silver badge clipped to his belt walked straight toward the stage. He did not look at the crystal chandeliers or the horrified billionaires cowering in the corners. His eyes were locked entirely on Thomas, who was still kneeling in the shredded remains of the Vanguard merger contracts. Before the agent could even open his mouth, Brenda snapped. The reality of her vanishing country club empire triggered a hysterical, frantic rage. She lunged forward, inserting herself between the federal agent and her husband. Her face was flushed, her expensive silk gown rustling wildly as she puffed out her chest in a final pathetic display of authority. "You cannot be in here," Brenda shrieked, pointing her diamond-covered finger right at the agent's chest. "This is a private event. Do you have any idea who we are? I will have your badge for this. I will sue you, your department, and the entire federal government. We play golf with a state senator." The lead agent did not even blink. He barely acknowledged her existence. He simply gave a sharp nod to a female agent on his left. She stepped forward, gripped Brenda by the upper arm with a firm, unyielding hold, and physically pulled the screaming woman backward out of the way. Brenda thrashed and wailed, her tacky emerald necklace rattling against her collarbone, but her threats evaporated into useless, pathetic noise. She was dragged to the periphery of the room, her social dominance permanently extinguished. The lead agent stopped 2 feet away from Thomas. He looked down at the ruined titan with absolute clinical detachment. "Thomas, you are under arrest," the agent's voice boomed, carrying easily over Brenda's fading shrieks. "We have federal warrants for your immediate detention on 53 counts of wire fraud, aggravated corporate embezzlement, and massive coordinated tax evasion." The words finally penetrated Thomas's fractured mind. The absolute, inescapable reality of a federal penitentiary materialized right in front of him. The begging, weeping man vanished, replaced by pure animalistic panic. The total destruction of his ego was complete. He could not talk his way out of this. He could not buy his way out of this. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his expensive Italian shoes slipping on the scattered contract confetti. He spun around, completely abandoning his family, his pride, and his dignity. He made a desperate, frantic dash toward the velvet-draped doors leading to the kitchen service hallway. He did not even make it 5 steps. A tactical agent flanking the right side of the room moved with terrifying speed. He closed the distance, lowered his shoulder, and drove his entire body weight directly into Thomas's midsection. The impact was brutal and loud. Thomas hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud, the wind knocked entirely out of his lungs. A harsh groan escaped his lips as his face was pressed firmly against the polished mahogany. The agent swiftly pinned Thomas's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed through the silent dining room. The untouchable patriarch was now just another subdued criminal writhing helplessly on the floor of his own exclusive club. The lead agent calmly pulled a laminated card from his pocket and began reciting the Miranda warning. His voice was steady and methodical, detailing the loss of every single right Thomas thought his wealth could permanently buy. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Caroline and I stood on the stage watching the entire execution without moving a muscle. The federal machinery operated flawlessly, dismantling the corrupt empire with absolute precision. It was the magnificent, beautiful culmination of years of silent, meticulous planning. Once Thomas was hauled roughly to his feet by two agents, his head hanging in total defeat, the lead agent slipped the card back into his jacket. He turned his attention away from the ruined father and slowly scanned the elevated stage. His eyes passed over me and Caroline settling squarely on the corner of the platform. He locked eyes with the architect of the offshore accounts. Kendrick was still slumped against the wall, staring blankly at the chaos unfolding around him. His shattered smartphone rested uselessly by his feet, and his hands were trembling in his lap. The lead agent took a deliberate, heavy step toward the stage. Kendrick the agent stated, his voice cutting through the lingering tension in the room like a newly sharpened blade. "Do not bother trying to run. We have a warrant for you, too." Kendrick's face went entirely slack. The color drained from his perfectly manicured features, leaving behind a sickly, translucent white. He had spent the last decade building a reputation as the smartest legal mind in Atlanta, a man who could construct impenetrable financial fortresses and bury any inconvenient truth under mountains of corporate jargon. But looking at the federal agent standing at the edge of the stage, Kendrick realized that his intelligence had just walked him directly into a federal trap. He did not attempt to maintain his composure. He did not ask for legal representation or demand to see the warrant. Kendrick simply collapsed. He fell to his knees with a heavy, ungraceful thud, his expensive suit pants tearing against the rough edge of the wooden platform. His hands shot up in the air in a posture of total, unconditional surrender. "I am cooperating," Kendrick screamed, his voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched panic. "I am fully cooperating. Do not put me in cuffs. I will give you everything. I have the ledgers. I have the routing numbers for the Cayman accounts. It was all him." Kendrick pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Thomas, who was still pinned to the floor by the tactical agent. "He forced me to do it!" Kendrick wailed, abandoning every single shred of attorney-client privilege and familial loyalty in a desperate bid for his own survival. Thomas orchestrated the entire Vanguard fraud. I told him it was illegal. I told him we were crossing the line, but he threatened to cut Madison out of the will if I did not forge the asset valuations. I have proof. I have audio recordings of him ordering the wire transfers. I will testify to all of it. Just give me a deal. Please give me a deal. The sheer cowardice of the man was breathtaking. The room, already stunned by Thomas's violent arrest, watched in absolute disgust as the slick corporate lawyer begged for his freedom by sacrificing his own father-in-law. On the floor, Thomas thrashed weakly against the federal agent holding him down. "You traitor!" Thomas choked out, spitting blood onto the polished hardwood. "You ungrateful, spineless parasite! I gave you your career!" Kendrick ignored him, keeping his panicked gaze locked on the lead FBI agent. "I can get you the recordings right now," Kendrick babbled, sweat pouring down his forehead. "I have them backed up on a secure cloud server. Just say you will recommend leniency. Tell me I am not going to prison." I stepped forward, moving away from Caroline's side to stand at the very edge of the wooden stage. I looked down at Kendrick, watching him grovel in the dust of his shattered arrogance. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small encrypted titanium thumb drive. "He does not need to get you the recordings, Agent Miller," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent dining room. I held the thumb drive out. The lead agent stepped forward and took it from my palm with a respectful nod. "He already delivered them," I stated, staring directly into Kendrick's terrified eyes. "Kendrick signed a federal immunity proffer with my agency yesterday afternoon. He has been wearing a wire all night." The absolute silence that slammed into the VIP dining room was heavier than concrete. Kendrick flinched as if I had shot him. He squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head in total, undeniable shame. He had thought he was playing both sides, attempting to secure a secret plea deal while maintaining his position in Thomas's inner circle until the very last second. He had not realized that I was pulling the strings on his immunity agreement. The revelation sent a shockwave of fresh horror through the remaining members of the elite crowd. The bankers and socialites instinctively backed further away, realizing that every single conversation, every hushed admission, and every arrogant boast made at this cocktail party had been recorded by the federal government. But the most devastating reaction did not come from the bankers or from Thomas. It came from Madison. She had been standing near the overturned cocktail table, paralyzed by the sight of her father being handcuffed. But my words broke through her shock. Her head snapped toward Kendrick, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The pieces rapidly connected in her mind. Her husband, the man she had married to secure her status as the ultimate Atlanta power couple, had sat in a federal office yesterday. He had signed paperwork to destroy her family. And then he had come home, put on a tuxedo, smiled at her, and worn a recording device to her family's celebration with the explicit intention of sending her father to a federal penitentiary. "You wore a wire," Madison whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying, venomous disbelief. Kendrick looked up at her, his face streaked with sweat and tears. "Madison, you have to understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "They had me dead to rights. Riley had my signature on the forged appraisals. I was looking at 20 years. I had to do it for us, for our future." "Our future." Madison repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. "You sold my father to the FBI to save your own pathetic skin. You wore a wire to my event." Madison's perfectly curated high society persona snapped entirely. The years of finishing school country club etiquette and polite passive aggression vanished in a split second. She let out a guttural, blood-curdling scream that tore through the dining room. She kicked off her designer heels and lunged. Madison launched herself across the polished floorboards, her manicured hands curled into claws, aiming directly for Kendrick's face. She moved with blinding speed, driven by the absolute fundamental betrayal of a husband actively destroying her entire existence. "You bastard!" Madison shrieked, closing the distance in 3 violent strides. "I am going to kill you!" Kendrick screamed and threw his hands up over his face, cowering on his knees as his wife descended upon him. She did not reach him. 2 tactical agents, anticipating the violent escalation, intercepted her mid-lunge. They caught her by the arms and waist, using their momentum to tackle her backward. Madison fought like a feral animal, kicking and thrashing wildly against the heavy body armor of the federal agents. She threw her head from side to side, screaming obscenities at Kendrick as the agents dragged her away from the stage. "Get her out of here," the lead agent commanded, not breaking his gaze from Kendrick. As the agents hauled a kicking, screaming Madison out through the shattered double doors, the lead agent pulled a second set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Your immunity deal was contingent on full, truthful cooperation, Kendrick," the agent stated, his voice devoid of any mercy. "But you failed to disclose the offshore accounts you opened in your own name to skim off the top of Thomas's fraud. We found them this morning." Kendrick's eyes widened in absolute horror as the agent stepped onto the stage. "The deal is void," the agent said, grabbing Kendrick by the collar and hauling him roughly to his feet. "You are under arrest." Exactly 1 month later, the dust had finally settled over the city of Atlanta, but the crater left by the collapse of the Vanguard Empire was still actively smoldering. The federal machinery moved with a ruthless clinical efficiency that completely eradicated my former family from high society. They had built their entire identities on the fragile illusion of untouchable wealth. When that illusion violently shattered under the weight of federal indictments, they were left with absolutely nothing. Thomas was sitting in a maximum security federal detention center awaiting trial. The 53 counts of wire fraud and aggravated embezzlement were ironclad, backed by a mountain of digital evidence and his own son-in-law's initial recordings. His high-priced defense attorneys abandoned ship the exact second his assets were frozen under the Federal Racketeering Act. He was now relying on an overworked public defender who had candidly informed him that a plea deal was his only viable option to avoid dying behind bars. Thomas was facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. The man who once dictated terms to state senators and banking executives was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, eating lukewarm cafeteria food, and sharing a tiny concrete cell with a convicted car thief. His bespoke Italian suits were seized, his country club memberships were permanently revoked, and his name became a toxic punchline in the financial district. The total destruction of his ego was absolute. Brenda experienced a poetic justice so profound it almost felt scripted by a higher power. The IRS, seized her beloved suburban mansion, her luxury SUVs, and every single piece of jewelry purchased with stolen corporate funds. Left with zero marketable skills and a thoroughly toxic reputation, she was forced to find immediate employment just to afford a cramped, poorly lit studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The former queen of the country club, who used to terrorize waitstaff and demand to speak to restaurant managers, was now wearing a stiff polyester uniform working as a maid at a mid-tier airport hotel. Her days were spent scrubbing toilets, changing stained sheets, and pushing a heavy supply cart down endless fluorescent-lit hallways. The woman who once threw screaming fits over the thread count of her Egyptian cotton sheets was now returning home every single night with aching feet and hands rubbed raw from cheap industrial bleach. Madison fared no better. The horrifying revelation that her husband wore a wire to her family celebration severed her marriage instantly. Their divorce was finalized in record time, but there were absolutely no assets left to divide. Kendrick's secret offshore accounts had been seized by the federal government, and Madison's massive trust fund was completely liquidated to pay back the defrauded Vanguard investors. Stripped of her wealth, her social standing, and her husband, she was thrust into the brutal reality of the working class. Madison was currently employed as a cashier at a local discount supermarket. She spent her exhausting shifts scanning barcodes, bagging groceries, and enduring the impatient sighs of rude customers. The harsh electronic beep of the register replaced the melodic clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Her manicured nails were chipped and she wore a shapeless blue vest over a plain white polo shirt. Every time a former private school classmate walked through her checkout lane, she kept her head firmly down, her face burning with a hot, intense humiliation she could never wash away. Kendrick received the most spectacular fall from grace. His arrogant attempt to play both sides backfired with catastrophic results. Because he violated his immunity proffer by hiding his own offshore skimming operations, the federal prosecutors voided his deal completely. He was disbarred, the state legal board stripping away his license with brutal swiftness. Unemployable, disgraced, and entirely broke, Kendrick was facing his own separate federal indictment. He was currently living in a rented room above a noisy auto repair shop, spending his days desperately writing letters to former colleagues who simply threw them in the trash. The brilliant legal architect was reduced to a penniless outcast entirely ostracized by the legal community he once dominated. Their misery was a closed chapter. I did not dwell on it. I simply noted their outcomes with the calm detachment of an auditor closing a final ledger. I shifted my weight in the plush cream-colored leather seat of Caroline's private Gulfstream jet. The cabin was a sanctuary of polished mahogany and brushed steel completely insulated from the noise and chaos of the world below. The soft hum of the engines was a steady, comforting vibration against the soles of my shoes. Caroline sat across from me, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. The afternoon sunlight poured through the oval windows, illuminating the gold flecks in her champagne. She looked relaxed entirely in her element and completely free from the burdens of her ex-husband's toxic family. We were currently cruising at 40,000 feet, leaving the Atlanta skyline far behind us. Our destination was Paris. It was not a business trip or a panicked escape. It was simply a celebration of absolute hard-won freedom. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid coat my throat. The taste was magnificent. I turned my head and looked out the thick glass window, watching the vast blanket of pristine white clouds stretching out toward the horizon. The sky above was a piercing, flawless blue, entirely devoid of limits or restrictions. When they left me at Gate 42, they thought they were dropping dead weight. I spoke the words aloud, my voice steady and completely devoid of bitterness. They didn't realize they were creating the architect of their destruction. Blood doesn't make you family. Family are the ones who send the jet when you're left behind. Caroline smiled warmly, raising her glass toward me in a silent gesture of solidarity and triumph. We clinked our flutes together, the bright chime ringing beautifully through the quiet luxury of the cabin. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The lesson from this story is that relationships built on greed and superficial status will always collapse under intense pressure. When the federal agents raided the country club, the illusion of family loyalty vanished instantly. Kendrick eagerly betrayed Thomas to save himself, proving that toxic people only value survival. Madison and Brenda lost their identities because their worth was tied entirely to stolen wealth. True power does not come from money or elite social circles. It comes from walking away from abuse to build an authentic life. Please share your unique story about cutting off toxic relatives and comment below.